page 20. We are on page 20, and the Chaf, we started the Mishnah, Chaf Amud Aleph, bottom of page 28. Nashim ba'avodim uktanim paturim mikriya shema, women, slaves, and katanim, children, are exempt from kriya shema and from tefillin. Uminat tefillin, next page, turn the page to 20b. And from tefillin, they are exempt from tefillin. So they're exempt from kriya shema and from tefillin, and we've talked about this a little, that, excuse me. Women are exempt from kriya shema, and we spoke yesterday a little about the fact that on the one hand, there's the mitzvah of kriya shema. On the other hand, there's also the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And the truth of the matter is, it's really is the first Gemara that we're going to learn right after the Mishnah. It does talk about that issue. We'll get a little more into that, about the fact that there is possibly a difference between kriya shema and accepting the yoke of heaven. In any event, our Mishnah tells us that women are exempt from kriya shema. Now, it also says that slaves are exempt from kriya shema. And the reason why slaves are exempt from kriya shema, as I mentioned, that slaves are partially Jewish. They're not fully Jewish yet. When they get freed, they would be considered fully Jewish. A slave is someone who's not Jewish, who wants to sells himself because he doesn't feel like taking on the responsibilities of life. And he says, you know what, I'd rather not have any responsibilities. I'll never have to pay a bill in my life, and I will just be a slave for someone else. That's what a slave is. And they sell themselves, and maybe they owe money, so they sell themselves as a slave. And ultimately, they have no obligations, financial obligations. Their master has to provide them with food. He has to provide them with a bed. And basically, they just have to, all they have to do is they know what they need to do, and that is follow whatever their master tells them. So in a certain sense, it's a certain type of lifestyle that they've chosen because they don't feel like having responsibilities. And,
Rabbi,
yes.
I had a question. Once the halakha, or once the Gemara establishes that women are exempt, does that mean that, is there a problem with women who wear tefillin, that they're wearing a men's garment?
That is one of the issues that is brought down. So that it's an interesting point that that mitzvah is a mitzvah that has that would carry with it a sin for women to wear, because it's only a men's mitzvah. There is a lot of discussion about this, if women would be allowed to wear tefillin if they want to. And I wasn't sure if I was going to get into that, but the common understanding is that even men are not really supposed to wear tefillin more than we are obligated to. So in the olden days, they would wear tefillin all day. But nowadays, it's impossible for us to keep our mind so concentrated on Hashem. And we limit the tefillin to our prayer. If you say Tehillim after davening, so you keep the tefillin on, maybe you could learn a little with the tefillin. But in general, we don't keep the tefillin on longer than we're obligated to. And for sure, a woman who's not obligated to wear tefillin should not wear the tefillin, because even men, we discourage wearing tefillin longer than because we are not in the league of the previous generations, that they would concentrate more on Hashem, be able to fully concentrate, not have any thoughts outside of their prayers when they put tefillin on. Nowadays, especially with the iPhones and texting and all that stuff, we could hardly concentrate more than 10 seconds on anything, and quickly we have to look at our phone. So how much more so concentrating for an hour or a half hour is official. It's really a little beyond our capabilities. So we limit the tefillin to what we're obligated to, and therefore women who are not obligated to wear tefillin really should not be wearing tefillin. But there's other discussion about it, more in theory, and but I don't know that we'll get into it. Our Mishnah says they were exempt from tefillin. So I was talking before about the slaves. Slaves are exempt from Shema and tefillin. The reason a slave is when he's bought by a Jewish owner. So the law is that he's supposed to convert to Judaism, but his conversion is not a full-fledged conversion. He becomes obligated in mitzvahs like a woman, which means there are a lot of mitzvahs that he's not obligated in fulfilling. And he's not fully Jewish. He's not allowed to marry a Jewish woman. And he's somewhere in the in-between stage. Now, if he gets freed, if his master says, you know what, I want to free you, then he becomes fully Jewish, he is now a free person, and he becomes part of the community. And he would be responsible in fulfilling mitzvahs like a man. That's why there's a story in the Talmud where they needed a minyan, and the slave is not counted for the minyan. So the owner freed his slave in order that they should have a minyan. That's quite an expensive a mitzvah, I must say, to get a minyan. He freed his slave. A slave, I would think, would be very valuable. It's long-term benefit of being, a free slave that would, service one for many years. And yet he freed him, so he became fully obligated to mitzvahs at that time. But while he's a slave, he's only obligated to mitzvahs like a woman. In the same way, woman is exempt from tefillin and from Shema, so a slave would also be. And then we talked about katanim, and we mentioned that there are two types of katanim. There's a katan that's before the age of chinuch, education, and the katan that's after the age of chinuch. Rashi says that all katanim, all underage, under the age of bar mitzvah, are exempt from Shema and from tefillin. But Tosfos does not agree with that, and he has sources that imply that a child at certain stages are obligated in tefillin and maybe Shema. And therefore, Tosfos says there's a difference between a katan that is below the age of education and a katan that is after the age of education. So according to Tosfos, a child, just like you teach a child to put to a bench after he eats, and you teach him certain mitzvahs, you teach him to do, you teach him to daven, you teach him tzitzis. So the same thing would be, you should teach him Kriya Shema and tefillin at a certain age, when they're of age, of education, when they can, catch on and understand. For example, the age of education for shaking the lulav is when they know how to shake it in all 6 directions. They can, remember how to shake it in all 6 directions. That would be the age of chinuch for a child for shaking the lulav. So some children, that would be 7 years old, some 6 years old, that ballpark would be the age of chinuch for a child. And each mitzvah would be that chinuch of that mitzvah, the education that they're of age to understand and know how to fulfill that mitzvah. So that's the understanding of Tosfos, that katanim here mean a certain age of a katan. The katan, the child who is below the age of chinuch, is patur, is exempt from Shema and tefillin. However, a katan, a child who's above that age of education, whatever, on his level, he would be obligated in Kriya Shema and in tefillin. So obviously would mean he has to read Hebrew in order to say Shema. He has to be, or have a good memory that he would, that he could know the Shema by heart. But that would be then he could recite the Shema, and he could sit in he's capable of sitting in one sitting reading the Shema for 3 minutes or 5 minutes, however long it takes him. But that would be the age of chinuch. For a katan, he would be obligated in Shema. Rashi says no, because the father is not always home, is often not home at the time of reciting the Shema. Therefore, because he's not home then, therefore he can't teach his child to say the Shema. And the Shema is limited to 3 hours, the first 3 hours of the day. And therefore, the child would be exempt from Shema until his bar mitzvah or close to his bar mitzvah. But until then, he's really exempt from the chinuch, the mitzvah of education, because the father, this is a very limited mitzvah, the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. Now we go to turn the page and we say, and he's exempt from tefillin. Now, why are they exempt from tefillin? So the woman is exempt from tefillin. I mentioned yesterday that the mitzvah of tefillin is a mitzvah that is, number one, is time bound. And because it's time bound, how is it time bound? Because you don't put tefillin on at night and you don't put tefillin on Shabbos. I can't say everyone agrees with that. There are different opinions in the Talmud. If tefillin is, biblically exempt on Shabbos and at night, but Rashi understands that this Mishnah follows that view, that the mitzvah of tefillin is exempt at night and on Shabbos, and therefore this would be considered a mitzvah that is time bound, and women are exempt. The reason why women are exempt from time bound mitzvahs is because of shalom bayis. Hashem exempted the women so that they should be able to fulfill their duties at home if their husband needs something, or the household is in need of certain things. So therefore, women are exempt in order to be able to concentrate on their household duties and on their and fulfilling the needs of their, the requests of their husband. So that would be the mitzvah of tefillin being exempt because it's a time-bound mitzvah. The same thing would be Shema for women. They are exempt. It is a time-bound mitzvah. And there is another source that women are exempt from tefillin, and that is because tefillin is compared to Torah, and just like women are exempt from studying Torah, they're also exempt from the mitzvah of tefillin. And when it comes to children,
I have a question. When you say women are exempt, this was at the time that you're talking about, when the Torah was given to Moses. Women were exempt from learning Torah.
Well, nothing changes in mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are always the same, but sometimes there are different applications because of the way things are, how to apply it. For example, electricity. They never had electricity before. So how do you apply the Torah laws to electrical gadgets today, or to computers and so on? So you have to know how to apply the laws, but the laws stay the same. So the law of women being exempt was always there. The only thing is that are women allowed to study Torah, and would there be a reason to encourage them to study Torah nowadays because of certain? In other words, the fact is the Torah exempts them, so they're exempt. But first of all, they have an obligation to know the mitzvahs that apply to them. That's number one. And number two, there is reason for women to study Torah to be able to handle the challenges that they have from the secular world that would, possibly they would need to understand more of Torah in order to overcome these questions that might come up and issues that might come up based on the fact that they're very intellectually engaged in the secular knowledge. They should be able to balance it with Torah knowledge. So that doesn't mean that they're obligated biblically in studying Torah. It means that there is reason for them to study Torah to be able to negate the knowledge that they have from the secular side, to be able to balance it and to understand the value of Torah and so on.
I asked
So
something
there's
else.
a reason for them to study Torah nowadays, and in addition to the fact that they have an obligation to study the mitzvahs that are applicable to them and so on.
Right. But what about the Chabad? Do the Chabad rabbis agree that it's okay for women to study the Torah? Do
Yes.
they agree? They do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Robert. You're muted.
As a follow-up to Susan's question, the ambiguity of the word exempt. I think that because exempt doesn't mean prohibited, because then when we talk about saying the Shema or studying Torah or putting on tefillin, I think there's sort of a sliding scale of what interpretation of being exempted is. So I know that, that in some liberal forms of Judaism, women I've seen put on tefillin, again, for whatever reason they want to be as a equal partner in being Jews. So there's, again, some, I guess it's that gray area of being, how do you interpret exempt versus prohibited, or being more lenient for women to study Torah versus not to wear tefillin. And just to sort of clarify that, because of the grammatic terms that we're using.
Right. Right.
You got a good point. Robert is emphasizing the fact that the Mishnah here says exempt, and it leaves it a little vague. And I mean, the reason it leaves it vague, we can understand, because there are differences. Shema, women, it is appropriate for them to say Shema. They're exempt, but it would be advisable for them to say Shema. Tefillin, it would not be advisable to say Shema. So the Mishnah simply says exempt to tell you that regarding exemption, they're exempt, but regarding what would be advisable, what would be appropriate, what would be the ultimate best way for them to fulfill Hashem's will, there would be a difference. Tefillin would be advisable not to wear tefillin. Shema would be advisable to wear Shema, to say Shema, and and so on. But so there are reasons why the Mishnah leaves it vague.
In the Steinsaltz, Rabbi, it says women's obligation in prayer. This question is based on a more fundamental dilemma. Is prayer a mitzvah by Torah or by rabbinic law?
Yeah, we're just about up to
According to the opinion that it is rabbinic, the language of the Gemara, like a time-bound positive mitzvah, is problematic. On the other hand, even those who hold that the basic mitzvah of prayer is by Torah law assert that the mitzvah of turning to God is
Susan.
by Torah law.
Susan, we're just about up to that. So.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so we've just explained that for tefillin, for women, the exemption, and now for children, the exemption of tefillin is because a child doesn't know how to guard their body, which one of the obligations of tefillin is a person has to have a clean body and a clean mind, and which includes the prohibition of a person's not allowed to pass gas with tefillin on, and therefore a child is exempt from tefillin. Now the Mishnah says v'chayavin b'tefillah. The Mishnah says that that women, children, and slaves are obligated in tefillah. Now, Rashi tells us that tefillah, prayer, is mercy. This is in the Gemara, it mentions this. Rashi adds that it's midrabanan, it's rabbinic. The prayer is rabbinic, and they established it even for women and for children. That means that tefillah, prayer, is a rabbinic law according to Rashi, and the mitzvah of prayer, the rabbis established for women and for children as well. It's all about asking Hashem for mercy. How is tefillah different than Kriya Shema? Why would women be obligated in tefillah and not in Shema? Well, it's not such a big deal. They're not so hard to answer that. It's the rabbis obligated them in prayer. Why are children obligated in prayer? They're not obligated in Shema. Well, what was the reason the children were not obligated in Shema? They were not obligated in Shema because their father is often not home at that time.
Right.
But what about tefillah? How are they going to know how to pray?
They have to learn from us.
How to pray, how to do the prayer. Their father's not home. So the Gemara is the understanding is, one of the understandings is that prayer, there's more time to recite than Shema. Shema, you're limited to 3 hours in the day. Prayer, you have 4 hours in the day, and in case of need, if a person missed that, you have really till midday. So there's much more time, much more opportunity to do the prayer, and therefore a child would be obligated. The rabbis were able to obligate the child in prayer, even though they're not obligated in Shema, because the father's not home often at those 3 hours of the day. Now, women, slaves, and children are obligated in mezuzah, uve mezuzah, uve berkas hamazon, and in grace after meal. Now, there is a little discussion here. How does Tosfos learn? Now, if you think about the way Tosfos understood our Mishnah in the beginning, he said that women, slaves, and children below the age of education are exempt from Shema and from Tefillin, but they're obligated in Tefillah. Really? Children that are below the age of education are going to be obligated in the whole Shemona Esrei. They're exempt from Shema, but they're going to be obligated in Tefillah. How is Tosfos going to learn? So you got to really think about, the way we explained earlier that we're talking about a case. What type of child are we talking about? We're talking about a child who's below the age of education, and he's exempt from Shema and from Tefillin. And the Mishnah continues, it says, but he's obligated in prayer, and he's obligated in mezuzah and in grace after meal. How is he obligated in these mitzvahs if he's below the age of education?
Mother has to teach the child. That's the whole point.
He's below the age of education. We're talking about a child who's very young. We're talking about a 4-year-old. It doesn't seem practical that we're going to exempt him from Shema, which is a page and a half, but we're going to obligate him in the Shemona Esrei, which is 5 pages. That's, how is Tosfos going to learn this? Again, Rashi is not a problem. The way Rashi learned, we're talking about a child, any child, all children, even above the age of education, they're exempt from Shema and they're exempt from Tefillin, but they're obligated in Tefillah. They are obligated in Tefillah. Again, they're above the age of education. Shema, they had a certain reason why they're exempt, because the father's not home. It's limited to 3 hours. Okay, so we understand with the Tefillah, they could be obligated. But Tosfos, how is he going to learn this? He said that it's talking about we're exempt from the child who's below the age of education is exempt from Shema, which makes sense. He's exempt from Shema because he's below the age of education. He's not really capable of saying the Shema and knowing the whole Shema and putting on Tefillin. But then we say that, but he's obligated in Tefillah. So Tosfos, the final conclusion of Tosfos is that the way to read it is Chayavin B'Tefillah is not going back on a child. Children are exempt from everything. Chayav B'Tefillah is only going back on the slaves and the women. They are obligated in Tefillah. Children are not obligated in Tefillah, and it really does not mean to include them at the end, the final sentence of the Mishnah. It doesn't mean to include them.
In other words, you're saying in Torah law, children are exempt, is what you're saying, according to Torah law.
Not only Torah law, even rabbinically, a child below the age of education is exempt from tefillah, from prayer.
But if you teach a child by rote, if you teach a child to say prayers before bread, prayers before
no, we're not
wine,
talking about that. We're not talking about blessings. We're talking about prayers. The Shemona Esrei prayer, which is a good 5 to 8 page prayer in the
right?
prayer book.
Okay,
So
they're
it's
exempt
a much
from that.
more complicated thing. But you're right. A child is obligated in education at a younger age when it comes to blessings, because it's very easy for a child
Right.
to remember a blessing. So we're supposed to start the children with blessings, with certain
Right.
small little verses and things at a very young age. Correct.
Right.
You're correct about that. Okay, so that really covers our Mishnah. We've now explained the Mishnah according to Tosfos, and now we're ready for. Well, I should explain the mezuzah. Mezuzah is considered a mitzvah that is not dependent on time. Mezuzah is constant, and the mitzvah of Birchas Hamazon as well would be anytime a person eats, would be obligated in grace after meals, and therefore a child or according to Rashi, a child and women are obligated in Birchas Hamazon, and according to Tosfos, just women and slaves would, and at a certain age, a child would be obligated Birchas Hamazon, the age of chinuch, for whatever that chinuch would be, the age of education for a child for Birchas Hamazon. Yes, Ezra.
You say mezuzah is not time bound, but don't you have 30 days, no more, put it up?
I guess once the mitzvah begins, it's not a time bound mitzvah. It stays forever. So just because you're not obligated initially until you really own the house or you dwell in it, what's called dwelling. But once you're considered a dweller in the house, once the mitzvah begins, it's not time bound. It's always. No, there's only a question of when it's considered. Until you own the house, you're not obligated, right? Until you rent it or you own it, you're not obligated in a mezuzah. Once you own it, or once you dwell in it, once you're considered dwelling in it, once it comes on, then you would be obligated in mezuzah, and it would not leave at any point. It stays. It's continuous. So I think that would be the reason why it's called a time-bound mitzvah. Okay, the Gemara now asks, we're on 20b, second line, beginning of the Gemara. And as I always request, I know we have more people here that are invisible, and it's nice if people can make themselves visible. So thank you. The Gemara begins, Kriya Shema Pshita. Kriya Shema, for sure. Obviously, a woman is exempt from Kriya Shema. And the child, a woman and a slave would be exempt from Kriya Shema. When the Gemara is asking Pshita, it's talking about a woman and a slave. It's not going on a child. And it's saying, what do you mean? Why should you even think that they would be obligated? Mitzvah saseh shazman gramahu. It is a positive mitzvah that is dependent on time. It's time bound, and therefore, women should be exempt because we have a rule. The whole mitzvah saseh, every positive mitzvah shazman grama, that it's time bound. Nashim peturais, women are exempt. So what that means is that a woman is never exempt from a negative commandment. She's not allowed to transgress anything negative. She can't go and eat non-kosher, transgress do something that's prohibited on Shabbos. A woman is not exempt from negative commandments, but positive mitzvahs, to go about doing a positive mitzvah, that's where women are exempt if it's time bound. And so the Gemara says that Kriya Shema is obviously one of those mitzvahs. We know that it's very limited with time. We've been talking about that all along, about how the time of Shema is until a certain time, and therefore it's it's a time-bound mitzvah. So the Gemara answers that why. So why would we even think that women would be obligated in Shema, that the Mishnah has to come and tell us women and slaves are exempt from Shema? Of course they're exempt from Shema. So the Gemara answers that Mahu de Tema. What might I have said? I might have said, Hoyel, since V'isba Malchus Shamayim, since it has the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, Kamash Malah, and it comes and lets us hear that she's exempt. So how do you learn this? Is she exempt from accepting the yoke of heaven?
It can't be.
What's the conclusion? The Gemara says that you might think that she's not exempt from Shema because Shema is acceptance of the yoke of heaven. So you might think she's not exempt. And the Mishnah tells us that she is exempt.
No.
So how do you understand that? So let me read the
Rabbi,
yes, Ben. Yes.
I think she's not exempt from prayer, and in prayer you can also accept the yoke of heaven.
So your thought is that the prayer, by when you say a blessing, that's an interesting thought, that if she says the prayer, the Shemona Esrei, she's really accepting the yoke of heaven when she says blessing, the blessing, and
Right.
accepts Hashem
That's why she can be Torah from Kriyat Shema.
Interesting. I'll have to look up if that's mentioned in the in any of the writings.
Rabbi, isn't it possible that the men are obligated to say blessings at a certain time of day, but the women don't have that obligation because of the time bound, and that we can still say Shema at any time of the day that we can? Isn't that possible?
That women should be allowed to say Shema anytime, and men have to say it in the first 3 hours?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there anything wrong with, I can't possibly think that anything that any rabbi would say to me, no, you can't say Shema any time of the day. That's absurd.
So, well, it's hard to say something is absurd because it's all based on the Talmud. So we have to see what the Talmud. Susan, we got to see what the Talmud says. But you could say I don't understand it, but we can't use that. You can't use the word absurd when it comes to anything of Judaism, because we have to know. We follow Hashem's logic, not our logic. So you know what I mean. So you can't use that term. You could say I don't understand it.
Okay, I apologize. I'm asking you is how can you limit?
So you have a point, and this is something that we're about to say. So it's very, very nice, very, very good point that you're making. So the Gemara that we just learned, the simple way of reading it would be that women do not have an obligation to accept the yoke of heaven. That would be the simple, on the surface level. You read this Gemara, it says that I would think women should be obligated in Kriya Shema because it's accepting the yoke of heaven. Kam mashmalon, it comes and lets us hear that they're not obligated in Kriya Shema. It's time bound, and they're not obligated, which would imply like that's it. They're exempt. However, the Bach spells out that the way to learn this Gemara is a little differently. And he says that the proper way to learn this Gemara is that the Gemara starts off by saying, obviously, they should be exempt from Kriya Shema. It's a mitzvah saseh. It's a positive commandment that's time-bound, and they're exempt from time-bound mitzvahs. And the Gemara's answer is, I would think that since women and slaves are obligated to accept the yoke of heaven, which is emphasized in the first verse of the Shema, so I would think because of that, they should say all three paragraphs.
Correct. Exactly.
So it comes and lets us hear that even though they're exempt from all three paragraphs, nevertheless, it comes and lets us hear that they're exempt from all three paragraphs. However, we see from here that they would be obligated in accepting the yoke of heaven and to recite the first verse of the Shema. So that is the new way of understanding the Gemara, not the surface. The surface level implies like they're totally exempt from accepting the yoke of heaven. But the new way is they would be obligated in accepting the yoke of heaven. I would just think that would obligate them to recite all three paragraphs. And the Mishnah tells you, no, they are not obligated to recite all three paragraphs, but they are obligated, or they're expected to accept the yoke of heaven. And it doesn't say clearly that they would be obligated to accept the yoke of heaven within the first 3 hours. So as Susan is mentioning, it would seem that they should be able to accept the yoke of heaven, maybe and recite the first verse any time in the day. Let me just read it in the Shulchan Aruch, and I'm going to read it from the chapter 70. This is the Shulchan Aruch Harav. I have it in front of me. Nashim ba'avadim peturin mikriya Shema. Women, slaves are exempt from Shema because it's a mitzvah saseh shazman grum. It's a time-bound mitzvah. It's which is only obligated at the time of going to lying down, at the time of waking up. Nevertheless, it's appropriate to teach them that they should accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven, and they should recite the first verse. So that's what it says in Shulchan Aruch. Now, they are also exempt from the blessings of Shema that also are limited with time. However, they are obligated in mentioning the Exodus from Egypt, which is a mitzvah that's not time-bound. Its mitzvah is day and night, and therefore they should recite the blessing Emes V'Yatziv, which is the blessing that talks about the Exodus from Egypt. And since they're obligated in the Shemona Esrei, so therefore they should recite those two blessings right next to each other, so they'll be both of those blessings are there's a reason to connect the two, because one of them talks about the Exodus from Egypt and the other one talks about prayer. And as we've mentioned earlier, we're supposed to connect Geula and Tefillah, the redemption from Egypt, and prayer, and therefore they should recite both of those, the final blessing of the Shema and the Shemona Esrei. If they want to recite any of the other prayers, they are allowed to. But children are exempt from Kriya Shema, even though it has the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, just like they're exempt from all mitzvahs. And this is when they're not of educational age of education. And some say even if they reach the age of education, they didn't obligate the father to teach Kriya Shema and its blessings, because the child is not next to his father in the time of Kriya Shema at night. And he's sleeping in the morning. And it's proper to follow the first opinion. And therefore, once a child reaches the age of chinuch, we should educate him in Kriya Shema. It's proper to follow. The first opinion is Tosfos, the second opinion is Rashi, right? Now we see the Shulchan Aruch, how it follows the Gemara and the interpretation of the Gemara and the Mishnah that we learned. Now, the Shulchan Aruch continues, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch continues, according to everyone, the child is obligated to teach a child in chinuch once he reaches, in tefillah and prayer, once he reaches the age of chinuch, like it'll be explained later on.
Rabbi,
So,
can I
this
make
is
an
the source. What we've learned here is the source of those laws in Shulchan Aruch. Yes. What did you say?
when the father is not available, it's up to the mother to teach the child or children from as young an age as they can pay attention.
Well, that would sound good, except for the fact that because they themselves are not obligated, so the rabbis did not obligate the mother to do something she's not familiar with. And
But
she's not obligated herself. And therefore, the obligation of this chinuch would not be necessarily on the mother. It doesn't mean she can't do it. She can. That would be very nice, but it's not expected of her because she might not know the Shema herself. And especially in previous generations where women, they didn't have regular education. And so there were many
know.
Right after me.
not able to educate their children like that. Yes, Robert.
I'd like, pursuing again on some of the questions that Susan has, is that, I don't know, I'd like to have a discussion, if not now, sometime in the future. We derive our birthright as a Jew by our having a Jewish mother. Because some of the rationale being is that, during those times when historically the father was the hunter or went out and was not imparting education to the child, while the mother would instruct the child again on cleanliness and maybe kashrut and other factors. But in our discussion now, there's a clear delineation between when a child becomes of his own and relative to saying the Shema or prayer or other things. And so I guess the question is, the basis of our birthright is having a Jewish mother. What does that mean relative to the child growing up as a fully enfranchised Jew? Does that make sense to you?
Right. So you're asking the question based on the assumption that the reason we follow the mother is because she is very involved in the education of the children.
Correct. The child is always by the mother's side.
And then you're stuck here because here it
Okay.
doesn't stand, you're right. That seems to, so the point is that I've never understood it that way. It's not based because the mother educates the child. That's not the reason why we follow the mother. I mean, it's really a law. It's based on a verse in the Torah. I don't know if there is a practical reason why we should. Maybe the practical reason could be the mother is a definite, and the father is not always a definite.
Right.
And that could be if you want to find some practical reason it's also the mother is the one who nurtures the baby for 9 months. So that is maybe more of the, just because so that really is what makes the child into a child. She brings the child from a nothing to a live baby. The father couldn't accomplish that. And therefore, it would seem, but if that's again, if you want to try to figure out some logical reason why that is, I guess what, if you really want to know, I'm just throwing thoughts again.
That's good because I've not had this conversation before.
But I guess the best place to look would be in the Minchas, in the Sefer HaChinuch, in the Moreh Nevuchim. These would be the places to look to see what the the philosophy, the rabbis of philosophy explain, and obviously it would be based on Talmudic teachings in different places. But this would be a good proof that the reason, the original reason that that you had mentioned, this would be a good proof to show that that's not the reason.
So the evidence is there. We just need to discover it, right?
Right. We have to go through. So again, if you stay with me for 49 years, I hope
maybe the 50th year it'll work. Thank you. I appreciate your humor and your help.
Right. Ezra, yes, do you want to answer this question?
It says Veshinantam, Veshinanta Bam. It doesn't say Veshinant Bam.
לבניך.
Okay? So therefore, the obligation is on the father and not on the mother.
That's an interesting thought. I don't know if that's,
That's what I said.
I'm not sure. Do you have a source for that? I mean, it sounds like a nice insight.
Rabbi, it's part of the Shema.
No, I understand. But the point is, Vishinantam levanecha is, number one, is talking about Torah, teaching your child Torah. So
what is what's the Kriyat Shema? You know, Kriyat Shema is Torah.
it's in the Shema, but is it teaching him the obligation to say the Shema? Does Vishinantam. Now, the fact is that the mitzvah of chinuch is also generally understood a mitzvah, a rabbinic mitzvah, which would imply that the source is not vishinantam levanecha, but it would be a rabbinic obligation of chinuch. So I'm just saying, like, it would be hard to say the vishinantam again. If you find the source, then we could look into it. But it's an interesting thought. Ezra has a verse that seems that's talking in the male, which sounds like a very nice verse, very nice proof. But I don't, if you really want to, what we need to do is find out the different opinions of chinuch. Is chinuch biblical or is it rabbinic? And would the mitzvah vishinantam be a source for the biblical, for a biblical obligation? Because we just said that a father is not obligated in teaching his child Shema, so he's not obligated, but yet the verse says Vishinantam levanecha, which implies that there is a mitzvah of a father on a child. So the simple answer is that that's talking about Torah. But we need to, again, we would need to go through the different Gemaras of what it speaks about Vishinantam, But a good thought. It's definitely a good try, Ezra. Very good try. Yes, Ben. Ben.
I wanted to say two things. One is Veshinanta lebanecha can mean you study it with your son, and he will be obligated when you get to age of chinuch. It doesn't mean that you are obligated before the age of chinuch. But I also wanted to say it says lebanecha, because in the future the women are not obligated, but the men are. So it doesn't say leyeladecha, it says lebanecha.
Say your second point one more time. I just flew right by me.
It shows that in the future, when the child grows up, he will be obligated to say it. But it doesn't mean that the girls will be obligated to say it when they grow up.
Because it says levanecha.
Oh,
Levanecha, not livnotecha.
Right.
Right.
And I also wanted to say the child is not obligated until age of chinuch, because we are not allowed to say a blessing or a prayer in the wrong way. And until a child is of age of chinuch, you cannot depend on him that he will say it correctly.
I don't know about that, because the whole idea is we're teaching him how to say it. So I don't know if that's such a big issue.
Yes, but you cannot depend on it.
practice situation.
I didn't hear. What did you answer me, Ben?
I said, but you cannot depend on it until he's of age that shows responsibility and shows that he'll be able to say it correctly.
But you have to start somewhere.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know if it's such an issue because you're educating him and you're trying to teach him, but
Doesn't mean that he's learning.
Rabbi,
Okay, all right. Yes, Phyllis.
when, at least, when we're speaking in English, when we use a term generally for children, like when we say mankind, it usually refers to both males and females. And I always thought, I don't know, maybe this is just the way my mind works, but when I've seen the term lebanecha, it seemed to me that it meant the klal, that it means both male and female children together, because banecha, doesn't banecha refer to children in general, as since the male term includes both male and female?
Ben, you got someone strong claim against your interpretation. She's got a powerful point.
Yes, but that doesn't explain why in the future the women are not responsible. She doesn't explain why in the future the women are not responsible for saying it. That's why only the sons learn it.
You're saying logically it would make sense not to obligate to teach the daughters because they're not going to be obligated when they get older. That's a good point. Okay, you both have some good points there. In any event, we are going to continue, and we just learned this Gemara, and the way we translated the Gemara is that women are expected to recite the first verse of Shema, at least, because they should accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven. And I mentioned that I'm not sure. I have to look it up and see if it's brought down, if they should be reciting that before the 3 hours of the day. I don't think so. It would seem that the obligation of accepting the yoke of heaven for a woman should be doesn't say, at least in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Harav doesn't say, at least in it where I'm looking here, it doesn't say that they should recite it at a certain time. So in any event, that's the understanding. The initial thought of the Gemara is they should recite all 3 paragraphs, and really they don't have to. Now, I should also mention that the next Gemara and our Mishnah had mentioned that they are obligated in tefillah, but there's a lot of discussion of to what extent. And generally, women are it really depends on their situation. For example, when they're busy with bringing up their children, so they have a lot less time and less ability to daven than when they're retired and their children are grown up and so on, and they have a lot more free time on their hands. So there are women that, I'm trying to remember who it was that mentioned about his mother, who was there was a certain Rav whose mother, he says he doesn't remember his mother ever davening when she was taking care of them. But when they, when after the kids grew up, then of course she davened regular. So there is an exemption. And so the question is, to what extent are women expected to daven? But we're gonna now read it in the Gemara, and maybe we'll go through the different opinions, and not just different opinions, but like what is the most important parts of the prayers that they should choose to say if they are limited with what they can pray. How much of the prayers and to which prayers should be given priority. So let's read it in the Gemara. First, the Gemara says, "Uminat tefillin." Oh, so first, I'm sorry. First, we talk about tefillin. I skipped the Gemara. The Gemara first mentions tefillin, that the women, children, slaves are exempt from tefillin. Pshita, the Gemara says, of course, they're exempt from tefillin. Mahu detema, I may have thought that hayil v'yiskish lemezuzah, since tefillin is comparable to mezuzah because it says it right next to each other. Ukshartam la'ois al yodecha, you should tie them as a sign upon your hand, and they will be for reminder, phylacteries between your eyes, and you shall write them on the mezuzah beisecha, and you should write them. So it says the mezuzah right next to tefillin. So I would think that there is a comparison because they're mentioned right next to each other. Kamash Malan, it comes and lets us here know that tefillin they're exempt from, but mezuzah they are obligated in. So this would be a thought. There would be a thought that maybe women who are exempt, who are exempt from tefillin, maybe they really should be obligated in tefillin because tefillin is compared to mezuzah. And the answer is no. That the Mishnah comes and lets us hear that they are exempt from tefillin. The Gemara now talks about tefillah, v'chayavin b'tefillah. They are obligated in tefillah. The Mishnah said they're obligated to pray. Derachameininu, because prayer is asking Hashem for mercy. And Rashi tells us this is rabbinic. Rabbinically, prayer they're obligated in prayer. Prayer is a rabbinic obligation. And therefore, the Gemara does not ask, obviously, women should be obligated in prayer or not obligated. The Gemara doesn't use that term because something rabbinic is not connected to the law of time-bound mitzvahs. If it's rabbinic, it doesn't have that exemption. Biblical mitzvahs have an exemption of being time-bound, but rabbinic mitzvahs are not within that category of time-bound, at least according to Rashi. And maybe we'll see Tosfos tomorrow that Tosfos argues with that. But Rashi holds
Rabbi,
that because it's rabbinic, then you don't have this issue of time-bound. Women would be obligated in the tefillah. There's no reason to assume that they're exempt from tefillah. But the Gemara explains that it's the reason why they're exempt, the reason why they're obligated of tefillah is because it's mercy, and they also need to have mercy. Yes, Moshe.
well, it's understandable because that it's not the right. So because you see, when a woman is nursing during the time of day where it's considered time bound, she can't put on tefillin. You know, I mean, it's understandable. If a woman is nursing her child during that time, you know, it's not possible to put on tefillin at that time. You know, so Rashi's explanation seems to be very much on target. You know, I mean, that's obviously. You know, emet, you know, I mean, it's, there's no other way that I don't see how a woman could put on tefillin when she's nursing, you know.
Yeah, but she's not nursing all the time.
But I'm saying during that time when you put on
Right, all
tefillin,
right,
if
but
she's nursing.
But tefillin isn't,
It's not, you know, they're not nursing, you know, like 10 hours a day. It's only a short period of time. And after that, you know, your response really doesn't answer the question.
I'm just wondering, Moshe, what are you referring to? Which Rashi?
No, I'm referring to what you're saying, but I'm just trying to say that in the morning.
From tefillin? Which exemption? What are you?
Exempt from
You're talking about
tefillin,
tefillah, prayer, or tefillin? Which one?
No, not tefillah, not tefillah. I'm talking about tefillin. It's not a woman, you know.
I didn't say a woman is exempt.
All of a sudden, you know, she puts on tefillin and her child starts crying, and, you know, wants to be nursed, you know, it's very difficult.
I was talking about tefillah, prayer. Tefillin is a different story.
Yeah.
Tefillin, we mentioned that women are exempt to time-bound mitzvah, or tefillin is compared to Torah. So I didn't really talk about tefillin. And with regard to tefillah, I don't think it's limited to nursing. No one said, you know, it's not Rashi doesn't say anything about nursing. So, there are numerous, the fact that women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs is even women that don't have children. They're exempt from time-bound mitzvahs. And part of it was shalom bayis, which is the obligation. If they have to follow up the mitzvahs, the time-bound mitzvahs, there could become issues of shalom bayis because the husband needs this, and part of a good marriage is the wife fulfills the tries to service her husband, and not a slave like the Arabs, chas v'shalom, but they're part of a good marriage is a woman provides at least at the home things that are necessary for a husband, and so that would be an exemption from time-bound mitzvahs. But in any event, we're gonna have to stop here because my time is up, and Mitzvah Hashem will continue tomorrow. We'll go a little more into the women's obligation of tefillah and the leniencies. If anyone wants to ask